So far, we've only learned about elements that display information and content to our users, but that's not all we want our website to be able to do. Sometimes we want to be able to allow users to input their own information and content, and to do that, we want to use something called a form element. These form elements tell our browser that we want our user to input some information. And form elements are denoted by these opening and closing form tags, and form tags allow us to nest other tags within them, primarily input elements. And we can see here we have an example of an input element that accepts text as its type, and we can see the name of it is first name. So let's see how this looks in our browser. We can see that this input element allows us to click into it and actually enter some text. So we can say hello, and it allows our users to actually type. But of course, it doesn't give our users any information about what exactly we want them to input into this element. And so for that, we want to add something called a label. And we can see here a label is just denoted by an opening and closing label tag, and it gives our users some information about what this input element is designed for. So again, let's look at this in our browser and see what this input actually does. And we can see it added that text before our input box to tell our users what we designed this input element to be used for. But it's not the only way we can prompt our users. We can also give our element a placeholder. And this placeholder value will be displayed within our input until the user actually clicks into the input and begins typing. So input is the element, and it differentiates what type of information should be input by the user based on this type attribute. And there are a number of different values that we can assign to this type attribute. For instance, we can assign an email value, we could assign a number value, or we could assign a date value. And notice the date inputs don't allow us to declare a placeholder. So let's go ahead and see what all these look like in our browser, and we'll go through them one at a time. Of course, we have our first name input element still, and this email element looks very similar to this normal text element, but later on when we get into JavaScript, we can actually run some validation on this email to ensure that it's a valid email, or at least a valid email pattern. Then we have this number input, and we can notice that we got this incrementer here that allows users to either increment the value they want to input or simply type it. And lastly, we have this date input, which allows users to either explicitly type the date they want, increment it similar to how we do with a number, or even do a drop down of a calendar and select the date from there. Let's move on and take a look at a few other types of input elements, namely radio elements. We'll notice that radio elements contain a few different attributes. They start out with the same type and name attributes that our other input elements do, but then they have this value attribute, and this value attribute is actually used in combination with this name attribute. And the way that radio buttons work is that for every name, it can only have one checked value. And so we start out with the default check of our male value, but our user can select any other value. However, the radio button that is checked must be unique with respect to the name of the radio buttons. And we'll see that we have male currently checked, but if we check female, it unchecks male for us because they have the same name. Now we'll notice that these radio buttons break lines, and that's because we added one additional element to our radio buttons, and that's this BR element. And this BR is self-closing, and it simply stands for break line. Lastly, we need a way for our users to be able to submit the inputs they provided, and that's done simply with this submit input. And the submit input is essentially a special kind of button that tells our browser to actually go ahead and process the input that the users provided. And typically what that means is that we have some JavaScript code written to handle that data and send it somewhere or process it in some way. And we'll learn about that in our other course on JavaScript. We can see right here it looks just like a normal button but with submit named on it. But if we click it, we'll actually see that it takes all the data that we entered in our form and posts it to our URL. And that's simply because we don't do anything else with that data. So the default behavior of our browser is to just simply display it in our URL.